If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. Asterisk. Based on the facts about the attack of the inhabitants of the steppe, Taurus, Crimea, the Scythians on the Greek colony of Chersonesos, Taurica, whose ruins are located in the territory of Sevastopol. Asterisk. The steppe stretched level as the sea, flowing to the horizon as far as the eye could see. When the wind came, the grasses swayed like waves, but the steppe had neither the bright colors that constantly changed, nor the soul-soothing sound of the ocean. I, Heraclion, had grown up in a city where the sea was visible from everywhere. I couldn't imagine how one could live far from the endless, lapping blue expanse. The Scythians, enemies of the Hellenes, didn't understand how necessary the sea's proximity was to a human soul. Their bodies, it seemed, had never felt the gentle touch of waves and therefore smelled of something sour. This was the scent of an alien barbarian world, of felt kibitkas and leather wineskins, of sour milk. Everything about them was different from us Hellenes. Their gods, dwellings, clothing, weapons, even wine the Scythians drank differently. They didn't dilute it, but drank it as if it were water. And immediately they would fall asleep, embracing empty amphoras, or bellow songs, drawn out like the steppe itself. I gazed longingly at the mountain outlines, behind which the sea was hidden. At midday, they brought me to a settlement, where felt kibitkas served as dwellings. Here were 4-wheeled and 6-wheeled carts, on which the kibitkas were placed when the Scythians set off to travel. Hornless oxen grazed the dry grass. The horseman who was guarding me untied my hands and led me to the largest kibitka in the center of the settlement. At the entrance sat a red-bearded Scythian in a chiton of coarse wool. Only by his cap with golden plates did I guess that before me stood the chief. The Scythian was kneading in his hands a piece of some white and shiny skin, resembling parchment. Noticing my amazement, the Scythian spread his towel on his knee and spoke. "This is the skin of a Hellenic merchant. See how thin it has become. I will order a towel made from your skin if you don't show me the road to your city." The road to the city, that's what the Scythians needed. Before, roads weren't necessary to them. They chose any path their horses could traverse. But now, when almost the entire Heraclion peninsula was built up with estates, reaching the city wasn't so simple. Labyrinth. This saving word came to my mind at the moment when the Scythian began demanding an answer. "I agree," I replied. "Come with me. I will show you and your warriors the path to Chersonesos." Labyrinth. I repeated to myself. Labyrinth. While it was still light, I and the Scythians reached the mountains from where the entire peninsula was visible. It resembled a palm with spread fingers, and the city at the edge of the cape, separated from other capes by narrow bays, was no bigger than a fingernail. But this was only how it seemed from afar. It was enough to approach Chersonesos, and you would be filled with pride that you were a Hellene, and your ancestors had transformed this bare rock into an impregnable fortress. Chersonesos was my homeland, and mortals don't choose their homeland or their parents. And if you are a Hellene, not a Taur dressed in goat skins, and not a Scythian who drinks mare's milk, you must fulfill the oath given to Zeus, Earth, and the Maiden, and guard more than life itself the walls of your city. How I would have loved to find myself in the circle of my friends. They spent the time when the heat subsided at the stadium, competing in speed and agility. Then they scraped their bodies with strigils, removing fatigue along with the dust of the running tracks. But barbarians couldn't understand the pleasure of swift running when the wind whistles in your ears and you hear the breathing of the athlete overtaking you. How could Scythians run on their crooked legs? But they were wonderful horsemen and archers. It was good that they had left their horses in the mountains. At night, citizens wouldn't fear their arrows. At night, the Scythians would enter the labyrinth and lose the thread. When the alarm sounded, they would blindly stumble against the walls of estates and towers until they collapsed in exhaustion. The Scythian chief approached a large stone and, bending down, tore off a snail that had attached itself to it. He brought it almost to my nose and said, "Here's your city. It is as small as this snail compared to the stone." The Scythian couldn't be denied cleverness, and there was some truth in his words. Yes, Chersonesos was small, and the barbarians' land was vast. It reached to the frozen sea in the north, and to the Rhipaean mountains in the east. No one had yet reached its edge, or could count the tribes living there. But if this country was so large, why were its inhabitants inhospitable? Why couldn't they give this stony peninsula to newcomers? After all, they themselves possessed steppes untouched by the plow, forests where fearless beasts lived. Helios had already hidden behind the mountains. Their clear, winding lines stood out against the pink sky. It reminded me of a knife blade with nicks and notches, such as I had seen among the Scythians. They were poor, these barbarians. Though they lived in the richest country, they didn't know how to use its benefits. Therefore they were hostile to strangers and envious of their property. I led the Scythians through a narrow passage formed by the walls of estates. How much labor had been invested to gather this stone from the plots, to clear space for vineyards and olive groves. Then it was necessary to dig up the heavy clay and bring water to the mountains. Was this futile Sisyphean labor? Or perhaps one should live carelessly, like the Scythians, who remain in one place while there's enough grass for their herds. Now the walls of Chersonesos were nearby, menacing and silent. I knew every hollow here, every irregularity. Here my childhood had passed. Here I had taken the oath. Its words, carved in white marble, seemed no different from thousands of other words. But now, after I had been in the barbarians' country, when I had come face to face with an alien way of life, the words homeland and democracy had become infinitely precious. Nothing in the world was more precious. They found me at dawn by the city wall. A bloody trail stretched to the moat. When the sharp-pointed Scythian arrow pierced my back, I still found strength within myself to crawl to the wall. It seemed I wanted to die touching it. As if it were a shrine, two ephebes placed my body on a shield and carried it past the barracks, the mint, to the agora where the oath stone stood. These were potters, cloth fullers, grain dealers, sculptors, money changers, sailors from ships standing in the harbor. They all left their affairs to honor the youth who had saved the city. The ephebes lowered the shield. My face still retained the expression of that resolution which the goddess maiden had given me. Just 7 days ago I had stood by this stone, and in the silence my voice had sounded. I swear by Zeus, Earth, Sun, the maiden, by the Olympic gods and goddesses and heroes who rule over the city and land and walls of the Chersonesos. And now I lay by the stone, silent and motionless. A crowd surrounded me. My mother bent over me in sorrowful silence. The demiurge Agasicles, the most eloquent of mortals, spoke from the speaker's platform about my life and deed. Look at the stones from which the walls of our city are built. They were hewn from the mountains of Taurica, not brought from across the sea whence our ancestors came. For 200 years these walls have protected our democracy and our way of life, and we who live behind these walls have every right to call Chersonesos our homeland. Our life and our death belong to her. Thrice beloved, Heraclion, son of Apollodorus, chose rather to perish than bring misfortune upon his city. He led the enemies into a trap, and they all perished to the last man. The council has decided to honor the youth who distinguished himself with courage and ordered him to be buried within the city limits. Let the most talented of artists depict Heraclion on the funeral tablet as we remember him. An approving roar rolled across the agora. The noise of voices merged with the rumble of waves. The sea that morning was particularly stormy, as if it too could not calm down after the anxious night. I felt the cold stone beneath my cheek as consciousness faded. My last thought was of the oath I had sworn, carved forever in marble, as eternal as the city I had died to save. The Scythians, confused in the darkness by the maze of estate walls and narrow passages I had led them through, had stumbled blindly until our guards could surround and destroy them. My deception had cost me my life, but Chersonesos remained free. The words of the oath echoed in my dying mind. I will not betray Chersonesos, the city, nor any of her citizens. neither those who dwell within the walls, nor those who dwell in the countryside. I had kept my promise to Zeus, to Earth, to the maiden, goddess. I had preserved the democracy that my ancestors had built on this rocky peninsula, at the edge of the world. As the Scythian arrow had pierced my flesh, I had thought not of the pain, but of home, of the stadium, where I had raced with my friends, of the harbor filled with ships from distant lands, of the agora where citizens gathered to debate the affairs of the city. All of this would continue because of what I had done. The barbarians would not plunder our temples or enslave our people. My mother's tears fell upon my face as the crowd pressed closer. I could hear the citizens speaking my name with reverence, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. The pain was leaving my body now, replaced by a strange peace. I had fulfilled my duty as a citizen of Chersonesos. I had upheld the sacred oath that bound all of us together. The demiurge continued his speech, his voice carrying across the agora. Let future generations remember this day, when one young man's courage saved us all. Let them remember that freedom is not freely given, but must be defended by those willing to sacrifice everything for it. I thought of my father Apollodorus, who had taught me to read the ancient poems and to understand the glory of Hellenic civilization. He had often told me that we who lived at the edges of the Greek world bore a special responsibility to be the guardians of our culture against the barbarian darkness that surrounded us. Now I understood what he had meant. The sun was rising higher, its light dancing on the waves visible beyond the harbor. Even dying, I found comfort in that sight. The sea that had called to me as a child still beckoned, but I would not sail upon it again. Instead, I would rest here in the city I loved, my bones joining those of the heroes who had come before me. In my final moments, I thought of the Scythian chief with his red beard and golden-plated cap. He had been clever, yes, but he had not understood what he was truly fighting. He saw only a small city clinging to a rocky peninsula, vulnerable and isolated. He could not see the spirit that animated us, the bonds that held our community together, the love of freedom that made us willing to die rather than submit to tyranny. The barbarians lived as nomads, moving from place to place as the seasons turned. They had no permanent homes, no walls to defend, no temples to protect. They could not understand the fierce loyalty that bound us to this patch of stone and soil. To them, our city was just another prize to be taken, another source of plunder. They failed to grasp that for us, it was everything: our identity, our history, our future. As my vision dimmed and the voices of the crowd became whispers, I felt a profound satisfaction. The trap had worked perfectly, leading the Scythians through the maze of streets in the darkness. I had brought them to their doom. They had followed me trustingly, believing I would betray my own people to save my life. How little they understood the Hellenic spirit. Even now, their bodies lay scattered in the narrow passages where our hoplites had surrounded them. Not one had escaped to carry word back to their tribe. The threat to Chersonesos was ended, at least for now. Other barbarians might come in time, but they would find the same courage, the same willingness to sacrifice that had always protected this outpost of civilization. My breathing grew shallower as the crowd around me began to sing the traditional funeral hymn. The ancient words, passed down from our ancestors who had first settled this coast, spoke of honor and duty, of the deathless glory won by those who died for their homeland. Soon my voice would be added to theirs in the eternal chorus of heroes who had given their lives for Chersonesos. The oath stone stood beside me, its marble surface worn smooth by countless hands that had touched it in reverence. Upon it were carved the sacred words that bound our community together, the promises that made us more than just a collection of individuals. We were citizens, united in our love of freedom and our determination to preserve the way of life our fathers had bequeathed to us. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays fell upon the stone and upon my still form. The blood from my wound had darkened on the ground, but it would nourish the earth from which new life would grow. In dying, I had become part of the eternal cycle that sustained our city, each generation sacrificing for the next, each hero adding his strength to the foundation upon which Chersonesos stood. The memory of my capture still burned in my mind as I felt life ebbing from my body. 3 days earlier, I had been walking along the coastal path that led to our family's vineyard, checking the grape harvest that would soon begin. The morning sun had painted the sea in shades of gold and amber, and I had stopped to watch a ship from distant Sinope making its way toward our harbor, its white sails billowing in the breeze. It was then that I first noticed the dust cloud on the horizon, moving too quickly to be a merchant caravan. My training as an amphibie had taught me to recognize the signs of approaching danger, and something about that distant disturbance made my skin prickle with unease. I had begun to make my way back toward the city when the Scythian raiders burst from a gully where they had been lying in wait. Their leader, the red-bearded man who had later threatened to make a towel from my skin, had ridden directly at me on his small but swift steppe pony. His bow was already drawn. An arrow knocked and pointing at my chest. Behind him came a dozen other horsemen, their faces painted with blue clay in patterns that made them look like demons from the underworld. "Surrender, Greek boy," the leader had called out in heavily accented Greek, "and perhaps you will live to see another sunset." But even as I raised my hands in apparent submission, my mind was already racing ahead, calculating distances and opportunities. The Scythians were fierce warriors, but they were far from their homeland, operating in unfamiliar territory. This could be turned to Chersonesos' advantage, if I was clever enough to seize the opportunity. They had bound my hands with rawhide cords and forced me to march with them as they retreated to their temporary camp in the hills. During that long, hot journey, I had plenty of time to observe their numbers, their weapons, their habits. There were perhaps 50 of them in total. A significant raiding party, but not large enough to assault the city directly. They needed information, a way to bypass our defenses and strike where we were weakest. As we walked, I began to understand their plan. These weren't random raiders seeking quick plunder. They had been sent by their tribal leaders to gather intelligence about our defenses, to map the approaches to Chersonesos that would allow a larger force to attack with maximum effect. The red-bearded chieftain carried with him a piece of bark covered with crude markings, their attempt at cartography. I realized they were trying to understand the layout of our peninsula, the placement of our watchtowers, the routines of our patrols. This knowledge both terrified and exhilarated me. If these Scythians returned to their people with accurate information about our city's vulnerabilities, they could guide an army of thousands directly to our gates. But if they never returned at all, if they vanished completely in the maze of estate walls and narrow paths that surrounded Chersonesos, then the threat would die with them. The labyrinth that was the key. Every citizen of Chersonesos knew the winding passages between the suburban villas and farmsteads that covered the Heraclion peninsula. We had grown up playing in those narrow alleys, hiding among the vineyard terraces, racing along the stone walls that divided one property from another. To us, it was simply the landscape of home, but to outsiders, especially those accustomed to the open steppes, it would be an incomprehensible maze. I thought of my father, Apollodorus, who had often taken me with him when he visited the outlying estates on city business. He served on the Council of Elders and was responsible for overseeing the construction of new water channels and defensive walls. Through his work, I had learned the history of our settlement, how successive generations of colonists had gradually expanded outward from the original Acropolis, each family claiming and improving a plot of land, connecting their holdings with those of their neighbors through an intricate network of shared walls and communal passages. What had grown organically over 2 centuries would appear chaotic and confusing to nomads who were used to navigating by landmarks visible from great distances. Distinctive hills, river bends, isolated groves of trees. Here on the peninsula, every view was blocked by walls or buildings. Every path seemed to branch and subdivide endlessly. A stranger could walk in circles for hours without realizing he was retracing his steps. This was my advantage, my weapon against the Scythian threat. But using it would require me to sacrifice everything I held dear. As the sun began to set on my second day in captivity, I finally made my offer to guide them to Chersonesos. The chieftain had been questioning me relentlessly, alternating between threats and promises, trying to break my resolve. When he showed me that grotesque towel made from human skin, I saw my opportunity and seized it. "I will show you the way," I had said, trying to keep the tremor of anticipation out of my voice. "But it must be at night, when the guards are fewer and the paths are shadowed. In daylight, we would be seen from the watchtowers. The Scythian leader had nodded approvingly at this apparent proof of my treachery. He was pleased to have broken what he saw as typical Greek weakness, our supposed love of life over honor. How wrong he was about the nature of Hellenic courage. That night, as I led the war party through the darkness toward my beloved city, every step was a small agony. I was walking toward my own death, but also toward the preservation of everything I had sworn to protect. The oath I had taken just 7 days before echoed in my thoughts. I will not betray Chersonesos, nor any of her citizens, whether they dwell within the walls or in the countryside. Some might argue that what I was doing constituted betrayal, leading enemies to the very gates of my homeland. But I knew better. I was not betraying Chersonesos. I was delivering her enemies into a trap from which none would emerge alive. The irony was not lost on me that the Scythians' own ignorance and prejudice made my plan possible. They saw us Greeks as soft, civilized, corrupted by luxury and comfort. They believed that any man faced with death would choose life at any cost, that our talk of honor and duty was mere posturing. Their contempt for our values blinded them to the possibility that I might willingly die to protect my city. As we approached the first of the suburban estates, I began to narrate what I pretended was intelligence about our defenses. The outer walls are weakest on the eastern side, I whispered to the chieftain, where the sea has eroded the foundations, but we must approach from the north, through the olive groves, to avoid the sentries. In truth, I was leading them into the most defensible part of our territory, where narrow passages between high stone walls would channel them into perfect killing grounds. Our militia had trained for exactly this scenario. Enemy forces trapped in the winding streets, while archers positioned on rooftops and walls rained arrows down upon them. The Scythians followed eagerly, their eyes gleaming with anticipation of the rich plunder that awaited them. They spoke among themselves in their harsh language, no doubt planning how they would divide the spoils once the city fell. I understood enough of their tongue to catch references to Greek gold, to the famous wine of Chersonesos, to the skilled slave girls who would fetch high prices in the markets of distant lands. Their casual discussion of enslaving my people, of destroying the civilization my ancestors had built, only strengthened my resolve. These were not merely military enemies, but representatives of everything that threatened the Hellenic way of life: chaos against order, barbarism against culture, nomadic destruction against settled creation. As we moved deeper into the maze of estates, I began to notice signs that my plan was working. The Scythians were growing confused and irritable, unsure of their direction despite my apparent guidance. Several times, warriors who had been sent ahead to scout returned with reports that the path I had indicated led only to dead ends or impenetrable walls. "The Greeks build like ants," one of them complained to his chieftain. "Their tunnels go nowhere." The red-bearded leader shot me a suspicious glance, but I met his gaze with what I hoped looked like nervous sincerity. "The defenses are designed to confuse invaders," I explained. "Trust me a little longer." In fact, there were no secret ways, only the patient, methodical knowledge that came from a lifetime of living in this landscape. I was leading them through a route that would eventually deposit them in a small square surrounded on all sides by high walls, with only 2 narrow exits. It was there that our city guard would be waiting, alerted by the signals I had been leaving along our path. A broken branch here, a displaced stone there, subtle markers that would be meaningless to the Scythians, but clear as written words to any citizen of Chersonesos. The signals were an old system, developed during the Persian Wars, when our ancestors had faced similar threats. Every Ephebe learned the code as part of his military training. A piece of pottery placed just so beside a doorway meant enemies approaching from the east. 3 small stones arranged in a line indicated send reinforcements to the central square. A torn piece of cloth, tied to an olive branch, requested archers to the rooftops immediately. As we walked, I left a trail of these silent messages, knowing that dawn patrols would find them and understand their meaning. By the time we reached our destination, the trap would be fully prepared. But I also knew that I would not survive to see our victory. The moment the Scythians realized they had been deceived, they would kill me in rage and frustration. The arrow that would soon pierce my back was already knocked in someone's bowstring, waiting only for the moment of revelation. This knowledge filled me not with fear, but with a strange kind of peace. Death in service to one's city was the highest honor a citizen could achieve. The heroes of old Leonidas at Thermopylae, the brave men who fell at Marathon, had faced the same choice and made the same decision. Now it was my turn to add my name to that glorious roster. As the eastern sky began to show the first pale traces of dawn, we finally approached the square where the trap would be sprung. I could already see, silhouetted against the lightening sky, the distinctive shapes of hoplite helmets along the rooftop edges. My fellow citizens were in position, ready to exact vengeance for this violation of our territory. The Scythian chieftain was growing increasingly agitated as he realized that we seemed to be moving away from, rather than toward, the main walls of Chersonesos. He grabbed my shoulder roughly and spun me around to face him. "Where are you leading us, Greek dog?" he snarled. "This is not the way to your city." I met his furious gaze steadily and spoke the words that sealed both our fates. "You are wrong, barbarian. This is indeed the way to Chersonesos, the way to your death and my glory." The comprehension that dawned in his eyes was almost worth the price I was about to pay. For just a moment, I saw him recognize the magnitude of his miscalculation, understand that his contempt for Greek courage had led him into a trap from which there could be no escape. Then his hand moved to his sword, but he never had the chance to draw it. The first volley of arrows from the surrounding rooftops cut down half his war party before they could even cry out in alarm. The narrow passages that had seemed like pathways to easy conquest became a slaughter ground where the Scythians had no room to maneuver. No cover from the deadly rain falling from above. In the chaos of dying men and plunging horses, I felt the sharp pain as an arrow found my back. The irony was bitter, killed not by the enemies I had outmaneuvered, but by my own countrymen, who could not distinguish friend from foe in the confusion of battle. But perhaps it was fitting. In death, I would be united with the barbarians I had destroyed. Proof that the price of defending civilization was always paid in blood. As I crawled toward the wall where they would find me, my last clear thought was of the oath stone in the agora, and the words carved upon it that had guided my life and now my death. "I will be an enemy to whosoever plots against Chersonesos, and I will defend her with all my might for all time." I had kept that promise. The barbarian threat was ended, at least for now. My city would endure, and perhaps that was glory enough for any mortal man. As dawn broke over the small square where I lay bleeding, I could hear the sounds of the cleanup beginning, the clash of bronze on stone as weapons were gathered, the low voices of our city guards as they counted the enemy dead, the creak of cartwheels as they began the grim work of removing bodies. Through my fading vision, I could see familiar faces, men I had trained with, competed against in the gymnasium, shared wine with during festival celebrations. Among them was Nicias, son of Cleomenes, who had been my closest friend since childhood. We had taken our oath of citizenship on the same day, standing side by side before the sacred stone in the agora. Now he knelt beside me, his young face streaked with tears as he tried to staunch the flow of blood from my wound. "Hold on, Heraclion," he whispered urgently. "The wound isn't mortal. You can survive this." The Scythian arrow had found its mark with deadly precision, piercing through my back and into my lung. With each breath, I could feel the life ebbing from my body. The cold was spreading outward from the wound, and my vision was beginning to blur at the edges. "Listen to me, Nicias," I managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Tell the council, tell them the danger isn't over. These were scouts, sent to map our defenses. There will be others." My friend gripped my hand tightly, his own trembling with emotion. "What others? How do you know this?" With great effort, I forced myself to speak clearly, knowing that this information might be crucial to the city's survival. Their leader carried maps, crude drawings of our peninsula. They were studying our walls, our gates, the placement of our towers. This wasn't a simple raid for plunder. It was reconnaissance. Nicias nodded grimly, understanding the implications immediately. If a larger Scythian force was indeed planning an assault on Chersonesos, then my sacrifice would buy us only a temporary reprieve. The city would need to prepare for a more serious threat. "I'll tell the Archons immediately," he promised. "They'll strengthen the outer defenses, increase the watch on the walls. I felt a moment of satisfaction, knowing that my warning would not go unheeded. The democratic institutions of our city, the very system I had died to protect, would respond swiftly to this intelligence. Within hours, messengers would be dispatched to our allied cities, requesting aid and sharing information about the Scythian threat. Our citizen soldiers would be called to arms, and the walls would bristle with spears and arrows. This was the strength of the Hellenic way of life, not just the courage of individual citizens, but the collective wisdom of the community, where barbarian tribes relied on the whims of chieftains and the strength of individual warriors. We Greeks had learned to harness the power of organized civilization. Our democracy wasn't perfect, but it gave every citizen a voice in the defense of our common heritage. As I lay there, feeling my strength fade with each passing moment, my thoughts turned to the history that had brought us to this point. 2 centuries ago, my ancestors had arrived on this rocky coast as colonists from Heraclea, seeking new lands where they could plant olive groves and vineyards, establish trade routes, and build temples to the gods. They had found a harsh but beautiful landscape, blessed with natural harbors but threatened by hostile tribes who saw any settlement as an invasion of their territory. Generation by generation, the colonists had carved out their foothold on this peninsula. They had built walls and watchtowers, negotiated treaties, and fought wars, all in service of creating a small piece of Greece at the edge of the known world. The city they built was not merely a collection of buildings and walls, but a living embodiment of Hellenic values, justice, beauty, wisdom, and the ideal of citizen soldiers defending their homeland. Now I was about to join the ranks of those who had given their lives for this dream. My name would be inscribed on the stone tablets that honored the city's heroes. And perhaps someday, children yet unborn would hear the story of how I led the enemy into their own destruction. The thought filled me with a quiet pride, but also with sadness for all the experiences I would never have. I would never marry, never father children, never see the vineyards that my family had tended for generations produce another harvest. I would never sail beyond the pillars of Heracles to see the lands that lay beyond, never walk through the great libraries of Alexandria or study philosophy in the schools of Athens. But these regrets seemed small compared to the satisfaction of knowing that Chersonesos would endure somewhere in the city. Potters were still shaping clay into beautiful vessels. Sculptors were carving marble into lifelike forms, and scholars were copying manuscripts that would preserve the wisdom of our ancestors for future generations. Children were learning to read and write. Athletes were training their bodies for competition, and citizens were gathering in the agora to debate the affairs of state. All of this would continue because of what I had done this night. The barbarian threat had been neutralized, at least for now, and the democratic way of life would survive to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the sun climbed higher, casting its golden light across the blood-stained stones of the square, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. A group of city elders was making their way toward me, led by the demiurge Agasicles, who served as the chief magistrate of Chersonesos. His weathered face was grave as he knelt beside me, his experienced eyes taking in the extent of my wounds. "Heraclion, son of Apollodorus," he said in his formal, ceremonial voice, "the city owes you a debt that can never be repaid. Your courage has saved us all." I tried to respond, but found that speech was becoming increasingly difficult. The cold was spreading through my limbs, and my vision was dimming. Yet I could still hear clearly, and the demiurge's words filled me with a warmth that fought against the encroaching darkness. "Let it be recorded," Agasicles continued, speaking now to the assembled crowd that had gathered around us, "that on this day, Heraclion kept his oath to Zeus, to Earth, and to the maiden goddess. He chose death before dishonor, and his sacrifice has preserved our democratic way of life." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd, and I felt hands touching my shoulders, my arms, my forehead, the ritual gestures of respect that our people showed to dying heroes. These were not just mourners, but witnesses to history, citizens who would carry the memory of this day forward to their children and grandchildren. Through my failing vision, I could see the faces around me, young and old, rich and poor, native-born citizens and former slaves, who had earned their freedom through service to the city. This was the democracy I had died for, the community of free men and women who had chosen to govern themselves rather than submit to the arbitrary rule of kings or tyrants. In the distance, I could hear the sound of temple bells ringing out across the city, calling the faithful to morning prayers. Soon, priests would be offering sacrifices to the gods, thanking them for deliverance from the barbarian threat. My own sacrifice would be remembered in those prayers, my name invoked alongside the heroes of old who had given their lives for the city. As my consciousness began to fade, I felt a profound sense of peace settling over me. I had lived up to the ideals that my father had taught me, the values that our teachers had instilled in every citizen from childhood: courage in the face of danger, loyalty to one's community, willingness to sacrifice personal interest for the common good. These were the pillars upon which our civilization rested. The oath stone in the agora bore witness to countless such commitments, each citizen pledging to defend the city with his life if necessary. Most would never be called upon to fulfill that promise in such a dramatic way, but the knowledge that they would, if required, gave strength to the entire community. It was this shared commitment that made democracy possible. This willingness of free men to subordinate their individual desires to the welfare of the whole. My last clear thought was of the words carved into that sacred stone, the oath that had guided my life, and now my death. I will not betray Chersonesos the city, nor any of her citizens, but will preserve them to the best of my ability. I will be an enemy to anyone who destroys or wrongs the city or the citizens, and I will not listen to or conceal any plot against Chersonesos, but will reveal it and take counsel against it. I will not receive any exile hostile to the city, nor will I give him aid in word or deed. These were more than mere words. They were the sacred bonds that held our community together, the promises that transformed a collection of individuals into a unified people capable of great achievements. Whether we were farmers or merchants, craftsmen or soldiers, we were all citizens first, all bound by the same obligations and entitled to the same rights. As darkness closed around me, I heard a Gassicle speaking again, his voice carrying clearly across the square. Citizens of Chersonesos, today we have seen the true meaning of civic virtue. Let Heraclion's example inspire us all to greater devotion to our common cause. Let his sacrifice remind us that freedom is not a gift, but a responsibility that each generation must earn anew. The crowd responded with a cheer that seemed to shake the very stones beneath us, a roar of approval that echoed off the surrounding walls and buildings. In that sound, I heard the voice of democracy itself, not the rule of one man or a few, but the collective will of free citizens, united in defense of their shared heritage. My heart was slowing now, each beat weaker than the last, but I felt no fear, only gratitude for having been given the opportunity to serve something greater than myself. In a world where most men lived and died in obscurity, I had been granted the chance to make a difference, to alter the course of history through a single act of courage. The Scythian threat was ended, at least for now. The barbarian scouts would never return to their tribes with maps of our defenses, never guide a larger army to our gates. The citizens of Chersonesos would have time to prepare for whatever challenges lay ahead, time to strengthen their walls and train their soldiers, time to negotiate with allies and gather resources. All of this had been purchased with my life, and I considered it a fair bargain. To die in one's bed of old age was a blessing that many men enjoyed, but to die in service to one's city was a glory reserved for the few. I had joined the ranks of those heroes whose stories would be told for generations, whose example would inspire future citizens to similar acts of valor. As my vision faded to black and my breathing grew shallow, I felt one last surge of love for the city I was leaving behind. Somewhere beyond these walls, the sea was sparkling in the morning sun, fishing boats were heading out to their daily work, and merchants were preparing their wares for the day's trading. The eternal rhythms of civilized life would continue, uninterrupted by the brief violence that had threatened to destroy them. I had kept my oath. Chersonesos endured. It was enough. In my final moment, I heard the voice of my father speaking the words he had taught me as a child, words that now took on a deeper meaning as I prepared to join the shades of the heroic dead. The city is greater than any one of us, my son. We are mortal, but the polis is eternal. Serve her well, and your name will live forever in the memory of grateful citizens. And then there was only silence, and the peace of having fulfilled one's duty to the end.